Garden Healthy Home program is a cooperative effort between the University of California and the County of San Diego Watershed Protection Program. The purpose of the program is to bring information to us San Diego residents about how we can reduce pesticide and fertilizer pollution that ends up in our watershed. It's an important message for us residents because the majority of these contaminants that end up in the watershed come from residential properties. Businesses and agriculture are all highly regulated. So this is an effort on behalf of the Watershed Protection Program in cooperation with the university to get the word out about how we can reduce those contaminants, but at the same time still grow healthy gardens. So I'm going to talk to you about growing healthy plants and then how to deal with those pests when they do occur. So that's the gist of our program, and of course our topic is growing herbs for culinary use. So you can take them right from the garden to your table. Let's start here. Okay. So the path to a healthy garden then begins with growing the healthy plants. We grow healthy plants, they're less likely to suffer dramatically from incidents of pest and disease attack. So this results in the need for less pesticide, oftentimes eliminates the need for pesticides altogether. So of course the result is using less pesticide at home, we end up with a healthier watershed and a healthier community. So we can reduce the use of these pesticides by using a program called Integrated Pest Management. Integrated is just what it sounds like. We use a combination of methods all together, using them appropriately all together at the same time to reduce the need for pesticides and at the same time control the pests. So IPM is scientifically based on the interaction of organisms to the plants and the interaction of organisms with each other. So we'll look at how the pests attack the plants. What is it that they're doing to the plant? The more we understand about the biology of these organisms and their interaction, the more effective control measures we can apply. Then again, it reduces or eliminates the need for pesticides because we can get the pest right where they live, right? Okay? And this is going to save you time and money in the long run. Pesticides are expensive. They're difficult to apply. You have to read the little tiny print on those labels, wear goggles and gloves and all of that stuff to protect yourself. So IPM in the long run will save you lots of time and money. Our key strategy in integrated pest management, again, is growing the healthy plants. And we start right from the beginning with planting them properly and then carrying through to caring for them properly based on the needs of the particular plant. All plants have different specific requirements. Now we can, as we're going to talk about today, grow herbs in a garden bed or in pots, and they're going to have similar requirements, but there's a few of them that prefer things a little bit different now and then. So we'll talk about the needs of those plants and how we can best prepare ourselves, and we'll first start with planting them properly. Again, this will make the plants more resistant or better able to withstand attack from insects and disease. We're going to talk about 8 specific culinary herbs, and Scott, as he mentioned, has brought some of those for you today. I've broken them into 2 groups of annuals and perennials. So annuals are those plants that live for a single growing season, and then they die after flowering one time. That's their whole purpose, is to reproduce, and then the plant dies. And then perennials live from year to year and do not die after flowering once. They actually flower multiple times throughout their life cycle. So our annuals are basil, cilantro, which you would know as coriander if you were buying it from seed. Dill and parsley actually are biennials. They kind of throw a little curveball in there. They actually live for 2 growing seasons, typically 2 years, where they grow leafy growth and stems the first year and then flower during the second year. Sometimes they're treated as a perennial. In our climate, we can grow annuals and biennials for a longer period than in other climates across the U.S. Our perennials are mint. We'll talk about peppermint and spearmint, oregano, rosemary, and thyme. And then all 8 of these can be grown in containers, singly, or mixed together, or in the ground, raised beds, or directly into your garden beds. And I'll mention that again. Okay, so our first step in growing healthy plants then. And remember, healthy plants are the key to an integrated pest management program. We need to start right from the beginning. Learn about what the plants need before you decide what you're going to grow and where you're going to plant it. So many herbs will need a minimum of 6 hours of full sun each day, although there are a few that prefer shade in the afternoon during the hotter, drier part of the day. Annual and perennial herbs can be grown, as I said, in containers or in garden beds. Annual herbs you can grow them indoors with plenty of light. So in a window, something like that, although you have to be careful about very intense magnified sunlight through the window, so you have to be aware of that. And then perennial herbs should really be grown outdoors. You'll see on various television shows and things like that growing perennial herbs indoors. It can be done, but they'll behave more like annuals because they don't have the space, they don't have the sunlight that they need to really grow to their full size and lifespan. So it's better to grow those perennials outdoors, and same with the biennials. Herbs do not require heavy amounts of fertilizer. This is something I'll talk about later on. And then herbs especially do not tolerate wet, soggy soil. They like well-drained soil and so on, so I'll go into that more. It's important to remember that once these perennials are established in the container or in the ground, although there are some differences between container growing and in-ground growing, and I'll address those. But those established herbs, especially in the ground, do not like to be overwatered in the summer. They are drought tolerant, right? So we tend to water them more when it's hot and dry out. They don't necessarily need that. So we'll talk about how do we know when to water. And then herbs can grow well with minimal maintenance. You will need to do some pinching and so on, and I'll talk about that as well. There are some species specifics. So we're looking at different species of plants here. And we want to know a little bit more about each species so that we can start growing them healthy right from the beginning. So I'll go through these here in as best the order I can. Basil is frost tender. So if you're planning to grow basil through the colder winter, early spring months, you'll want to be aware of that. Part shade in the afternoon is required by mint, thyme, and parsley. So you want to plan ahead for that, and I'll talk about that a little more. Mint, any mint, can be invasive, so it's best grown in containers, or you can actually sink the container or pot in the ground. So I'll show you a diagram that I prepared just for that reason. And then, oh, excuse me. Your parsley seeds can take 3 to 6 weeks to germinate. That's important to know so that you don't give up on keeping them moist, right? You give up on them. Your coriander or cilantro seed may need to be cracked or scarified. So it's one of those seeds that has a very difficult time absorbing water if it's directly planted without scratching it with sandpaper or using a file that you might have in the garage. You want to give it a little file or a scratch before you plant it. It allows the seed to absorb water into the interior tissues, and it will germinate much more readily that way. Your cilantro plants may bolt to seed at temperatures above 85 degrees. So this is more of a cool season crop. You may or may not want to mix it in with some of these other plants. You can do it. You're just going to have to pay attention to when it gets ready to flower. You might have to replace it at that time. Because once you may have seen lettuce bolt. It puts up a big flower stalk. And then the lettuce leaves are not that good anymore. They get a little bitter, a little thick. They're leathery, they're not as tasty. And the same thing would happen with your cilantro. Your oregano and rosemary are drought tolerant once established. So those you would not want to water too often in the summer. And then your dill, direct seed with 12-inch soil depth. So some of these seeds you'll plant very shallowly, and some you'll plant more deeply. Okay, and then I missed cilantro and dill do not transplant well, so you probably do want to start them from seed if you can, and that'll give them a healthier start. So some of them, they're little idiosyncrasies we need to think about and learn about. Okay, move on. Okay, so again, proper planting. You can start from seed or purchase your plants if they do well from transplant in nursery containers. If you're going to direct seed, you can do this into the pot or into the garden bed, either way. And it's important to follow the directions on the seed packet. Smaller seeds, if they're planted too deeply, do not have enough energy reserve for the new leaves to reach sun if they're planted too deeply, and they won't survive the germination period. Larger seeds, though, need to be planted more deeply because they will have more seed, more reserve, energy reserve in the tissues. And if they're planted too shallowly, they don't root well. They kind of topple as they grow. So it's important to follow those seed packet directions. It'll talk about spacing when you plant, depth to plant, spacing, and then maybe thinning later on after they germinate. You may have to go in and pull some of those newly germinated seedlings out to give the growing plants that are left behind enough room to develop properly and not compete with each other. It's important to keep the soil moist while they're in that germination period. If you let the soil and the seeds dry out, typically the tissues will die off, they won't germinate. Or if they have started to germinate and you let them dry out, the seedling will die. So, and I'm underlining moist here because we don't want to let them dry out, but we also don't want to overwater them. And I'll show you what happens in a little bit here if we overwater. Fertilize seedlings with a half-strength water-soluble fertilizer when their true leaves have opened. Now what that means is, I kind of have a picture here, it's rather small. But when a seed germinates, most of these will germinate with two little seed leaves, they're called. Those were the tissues inside the seed that are responsible for providing the energy to that germinating seed. Once the true leaves or the first real leaves of the plant develop, then you can begin to fertilize. Oftentimes those seed leaves will be oval, much smaller than a true leaf. So the true leaf will be bigger, it may be shaped differently. When you see those true leaves open up and they start to pull in sunlight and water and photosynthesize, then those seed leaves will then begin to shrivel and fall off. That's when you want to fertilize. The growing seedling will then need that water-soluble fertilizer. You want to be careful, though, that you don't allow this water-soluble fertilizer to run off. This is how we end up with fertilizers in our watersheds, moving into other properties where they may not be wanted or appreciated. So it's important that we're watering the seedlings only using a watering can or a hose end sprayer where you can directly apply the water-soluble fertilizer to the plant, and you would do that on your regular watering day. You wouldn't add that in addition to the normal watering time. Before transplanting then, if you're starting with transplants or growing your seed and then transplanting it outside, for example, you want to make sure that they have strong 6 to 8 inch stems. So the stems need to be 6 to 8 inches tall, very strong, not weak and floppy, and they should be well covered with healthy green leaves before you transplant them out. If you started your seed indoors, in a kitchen window or something like that, you're going to have to go through a period of what we call hardening off. Get those seedlings ready for the outdoor environment, and you can do this by setting them out for a couple hours, 2-3 hours a day in the area where they're going to be planted, as long as they're kept moist and they're not allowed to get sunburned. They will eventually acclimate. You can do that 2 or 3 times before you plant them out. So you would take them out, bring them back in, get them hardened off and ready to go outside. Okay, so they need to be acclimated. All right, if you're planting in pots, and there's a difference between growing plants in pots and growing them in the ground. Mostly it's root space for roots to grow, but that has an impact on the development of the plant. First of all, your pots must have good drainage. You need at least one drainage hole in the bottom of the pot. More than one is better, but at least one, so that the water is going to drain through all the way through the bottom of the pot and out of the hole. You also need a planting mix that drains well. First of all, never take soil out of your garden and put it in a pot. It always will end up being very difficult to grow plants in that because it becomes compacted very easily. Our native ground soils tend to have some clay most of the time. Sometimes you won't. And that just gets really compacted in a container. So always use a pre-bagged commercial potting mix. And that should be a well-draining potting mix. So some of your cactus or palm, and if it's formulated for herbs, even better. Okay? If it's formulated for something else, it may not do as well. Moisten this planting mix before you begin the process of transplanting the plant. So you want your potting mix to start out moist, not dry. It should be moist. Your pot size should provide room for this transplant to grow. And then, so I've given you some sort of guidelines here. A single annual plant should be put in a pot that's about 2 inches larger than the root ball you're starting with. If it's a perennial, you may have to continually move that plant to a bigger pot until you have it in a pot that's sufficient for the size and maturity of that perennial plant. You can plant multiple annuals, mix annuals and perennials in large pots. You always want to make sure that your taller, larger plants are in the center, smaller plants towards the rim, and the medium-sized ones in between, sort of in the middle. This allows for the plants to develop to their appropriate size. It also looks nicer, right? But you get sufficient amount of sunlight contact with all the plants this way. Excuse me. You want to transplant your perennials in pots that are 2 to 4 inches larger than the root ball. And then water your plants, your transplants, about 2 hours before you actually move them into the pot. So you want to start with moist potting mix and a moist root ball. This reduces stress on the root system of the plant so that it's not dry when you transplant it into a dry soil, especially if you're doing this outdoors, and I'll mention it again. Putting a dry plant into a dry soil outside stresses it immediately. It may be a little time before you get back to that first plant and water it after you finish planting everything else. So if you start with moist soil and moist root ball, you don't have as much stress to begin with. And then of course you water immediately after transplanting. In a container you want to water to drainage. Now that doesn't mean that the drainage should be flowing off into the driveway or into your neighbor's yard or anywhere else, just until you get some water coming out of that pot, and then you can stop. Okay? Keep in mind too that oftentimes we put water on a plant, it takes time for that water to percolate through the soil and drain out of the hole. If it's not draining right away, give it a minute or so. If it still doesn't drain, then add a little more water. It should begin to drain very quickly after that. Sometimes we put too much water in the pot because we didn't see it drain right away like we thought we would. So keep in mind that water has to percolate all the way through that soil until it reaches the hole at the bottom of the pot. All right, planning ahead for planting in garden beds. There's a little more preparation involved here. So I'm going to talk about the location. You should know right away, you've already learned that herbs need at least 6 hours of sun per day. So you should be picking out a spot in your garden that gets 6 hours minimum of sun each day. We're going to talk about the direction of the sun. Why is that important? We want to make sure our tall plants are not shading out our smaller plants. And we also want to avoid excessive heat reflection from structures onto the plant. So I'll talk about that too again. The size of your growing bed is going to determine the number of plants you can put in that bed, considering their mature size. So some of your larger plants, your rosemary, something I might not have in the PowerPoint, oregano. I was just looking at my oregano this morning, and it's grown tremendously in the garden. So you have to account for their mature size. If we crowd plants together, don't give them room to fill out to their mature size, they will compete with each other, they'll shade each other out, so we want to avoid that. So the number of plants is going to be determined by the size of your growing area. And then therefore the number of each plant that you can grow as well, if you want to do more than one of each particular plant. We'll talk about soil preparation. It's extremely important, whether you're planting in the ground or in a raised bed, excuse me. And again, you're going to water your plants 2 hours before you set them out into the garden bed. Okay, so again, full sun 6 hours each day. Plant larger plants behind the smaller ones, depending on the direction of the sun. So if your house is facing south, for example, you would plant the smaller plants in the southern direction and the taller plants behind them, so that as the sun moves, your taller plants are not blocking the sun from your smaller plants. You want to avoid planting near structures that face the sun all day, because fences, walls, other structures will reflect the heat back to these plants, and some of the herbaceous plants can't handle that intense heat. It's also true for tomatoes, by the way. So you want to be careful of that. Make sure you're not too close to those structures that are going to reflect heat. In a 4x4 planting bed, you should be able to accommodate 4 rows of the plants we've included today in this presentation. That would be 1 to 3 upright herbs in row 1. And let me just jump back here a second. I apologize. If you look here, I start row 1 with your taller plants, row 2, row 3, and row 4, and the sun is coming from this direction. So your rosemary and dill are going to be the larger upright plants. Cilantro and parsley would be next in size. Basil, although it can get large if you don't keep it pinched. So we'll talk about pinching. And then your mint, thyme, and oregano. They're going to stay lower to the ground, so they're going to be the lower growing plants in your garden. Notice here that the mint is actually in pots, but the pots are sunk into the ground. That keeps them from being too invasive in the garden. Unless you have a tremendous amount of space to let them grow wherever they want and you're willing to deal with that, you don't have to put them in pots, but it does take some effort over time. Okay, so again, in the first row, 1 to 3 upright herbs. So row 1 could equal 1 rosemary and 2 to 3 dill. Row 2 could be 2 cilantro and 2 parsley. And then row 3 could be 2 of your basil. Row 4 was those low growing herbs, the mint, oregano, and thyme. Okay. All right, your soil. Garden soil is extremely important, whether you're working with just the soil that you have in the ground or building a raised bed. You want a medium textured, we call that sandy loam. So it has a mixture of sand, silt, and clay particles in it. It should be soft and well drained. Light, real sandy light soils, I know some of you may have those depending on the construction of the house when it was built. Some of you may have very heavy clay soil. Both of these soil types can be amended quite well with organic matter. The thing about that is you want to make sure that your organic matter is well decomposed. I mentioned it here. So avoid green organic matter. It's very high in nitrogen. It can cause problems with fertility issues and things like that in the plant. If you have a hard pan or very compacted soil, you want to break that soil up. It's better if you can do it when it's moist, but sometimes it's hard to get water on that to penetrate that compacted soil. So you could break it up first, whether you rototill it or use a shovel. We got a new tool at school the other day that's really, really neat. It's a little shovel, but it's like a jackhammer. We have terrible soil in Oceanside. And so we got this tool, and it's just an amazing thing. So depending on the area you're planting and the soil you have, it might be worth the investment for you. Okay. Your composted organic material can be something you've done on your own, but again, it should be like soil. Not a lot of plant litter, but it should be well broken down and decomposed or composted. Or you can buy the bag materials. Now, the quality of your compost is only as good as the source of the compost itself, the materials that you put into that. So be aware that some of your composting materials, especially your animal manures, can be higher in salt. You want to avoid soils that are high in salt. They will cause root death, and therefore the plant won't perform or grow to its maximum health, because the salt is affecting the health of the roots. All right, if you're preparing for in-ground bed, there's something you want to do called water, weight, and cultivate to help you eliminate weed seeds from the planting bed. So prior to cultivation, unless you have to break up that hard pan first, then you're going to moisten the soil. So if you've broken up the hard pan, moisten it. If you didn't have to do that, go ahead and moisten it to start with. If we break up dry soil, we tend to pulverize the soil, and then it becomes easily compacted later on. So always work with moist soil whenever possible. Not real wet, but moist. Cultivate the top 2 inches or more. You can go deeper if you like, but many of your smaller weed seeds are going to be in that top couple, 2-3 inches. Rake the area after you've cultivated, turned it, tilled it. Rake it to remove the old weeds, old crop debris, roots and things like that, and then water it. Irrigate it, and you want to put enough water on there that the water travels several inches into the soil. A good 6 inches is great. What's going to happen then, that's going to encourage those weed seeds in the seed bank to germinate, and then you can go back and kill them. Cultivate them, turn them over. You could even use Roundup at that point, but again, you want to be very careful not to allow runoff of that Roundup material. Roundup is one of those materials, I say Roundup, I should say materials that contain the active ingredient glyphosate. Roundup is the most well-known, but there are other products that contain the exact same ingredient, so I'm not endorsing any particular product. If you're going to use something like that, this would be the one time that you would want to use it. Give it time to break down before you plant out your plants. Otherwise, the easiest thing to do is just till these seedlings, weed seedlings under when they germinate. You can do this again if you need to, right? Because every time we turn the soil, we might bring more weed seed to the surface. If you think you've got a real good control of those weeds, then you don't need to repeat it. I would recommend repeating it at least one more time, just to make sure. And then you're going to amend your soil with the organic matter, if required, to improve drainage and air holding capacity in that soil. If you're going to move that soil into a raised bed, you can just go ahead and mound it up, yes? Or you can dump your bag soil into your pre-framed raised bed, whichever method you decide to work with. You want to make sure you're not filling the raised bed too full, so that when you water, the soil runs off the sides of the raised bed. You want to keep that water at the plant roots, not allow it to run off everywhere. Then the very large, I've said not to pulverize soil, but you also don't want to leave very large clods of soil, because they allow too much air penetration, too much water evaporation. Your seeds won't germinate, your seedlings may die, or your transplants may not have enough moisture around the roots. So break up those large clods. But again, don't pulverize the soil. All right, so we've planted properly. We've done a lot of learning and a lot of preparation. Now, how do we continue to care for these plants to maintain their maximum health? We're going to water properly, fertilize properly if necessary, And then we're going to prune or pinch. When we talk about herbs and herbaceous plants, we usually talk about pinching. But some of your herbs here, like your rosemary, can develop pretty heavy, thick, woody stems. So those you're actually going to be pruning with hand tools. Okay? All right. And again, watering and fertilizing in pots is going to be a little bit different than watering and fertilizing in the ground or raised bed. So in a pot, you want to water when the upper 1 to 2 inches of soil is dry, and just to maintain even soil moisture. So you want to avoid fluctuating between very dry and very wet. So it's important to maintain soil moisture. Watering too frequently is the #1 cause of poor plant health. We tend to cause root rot when we do that. And then, of course, your above ground portion of the plant can't grow properly either. It won't be healthy. So keep that in mind. Moist soil, not too wet, not too dry. You want to increase watering frequency as the roots fill out the pot. I'm sure you've all experienced the beautiful plant growing in the pot, and then all of a sudden it seems to need water all the time. That's because the root system has developed to fill out that pot. There's very little soil left in there to hold water. So those roots are in constant need of moisture. You can do that. You just need to be aware that as the roots fill out the pot, it's going to require more and more water. Perennials should be moved to those increasingly larger pots until they reach their mature size. And then plants need more frequent watering in pots than when grown in the garden bed, because the soil depth and width is much less for the roots to expand into. So you may water more in a pot than you do in the ground. Also pay attention to those clay pots. They're very porous, and the soil in a clay pot will dry out much more quickly than it does in a plastic or a ceramic glazed pot. So keep that in mind as well. If you're planting in clay, you're going to need to water more frequently. You want, again, water to drainage every time, but again, don't allow a tremendous amount of runoff. It's not only a waste of water, right, but you could be allowing runoff into places where you don't want it. And then you don't want to let your plants sit in saucers of water. And that's because the salts will build up in that saucer, and the roots will uptake those salts again. So the reason we water to drainage is to avoid salt buildup at the root zone. So always, especially our tap water is very salty. Yes? So not only that, but if you have roots at the very bottom of the pot and they're sitting in water, they could also rot. So we have salt uptake and we also have root rot. So drainage should always be allowed, and they should never sit in water. You're fertilizing, again, at transplant, you can use a slow-release fertilizer in a pot or in the ground. So slow-release fertilizers usually break down over time, releasing a small amount of nutrients. Some annuals and perennials will need repeat applications of the fertilizer. Most of your slow-release fertilizers are good for about 3 to 4 months. They'll provide enough nutrition. Again, in the ground, herbs don't necessarily need additions of fertilizer, but I'll talk to you about when it might be appropriate. Okay, watering herbs in garden beds. You want to, again, water immediately after transplanting into moist soil with a moist root ball, and then apply enough water immediately after transplant to settle the soil around the roots, so you don't have large air pockets that will dry the roots out. Maintain that even soil moisture. Don't allow extreme between dryness and watering. Excuse me. Coarse mulch 3 to 4 inches thick will minimize water loss from the soil. It slows down evaporation. I like to say that mulch has a 3 to 4 inch rule. It should be 3 to 4 inches thick, and it should be 3 to 4 inches away from the base of the plant. You don't want the mulch right up against the stem of the plant. The mulch will retain some moisture as well. That moisture is in contact with the stem of the plant and can cause rot of the stem. So keep that mulch 3 to 4 inches away and 3 to 4 inches deep. You want to avoid fixed schedule watering. especially now with our water restrictions and the drought situation we're in. In a fixed schedule watering, sometimes we're not watering often enough, sometimes we're watering too often. So you have to water as needed. That means you need to be outside feeling the soil in the pot, feeling the soil in the ground. So don't allow the plants to be stressed by watering too infrequently. You can determine the moisture of your soil with a meter. You can buy little soil moisture meters, and there's a gauge that tells you how much moisture is in the soil. You want to make sure that that meter is pressed into the soil deep enough to account for the moisture at the root zone. Now the roots are going to be anywhere between 6 and 12 inches deep in the ground, depending on the plant. So the meter should go down into the ground as far as possible. If the soil is moist at the root zone, but appears to be dry on top, if the plants are mature, you may not need to water. So it's going to depend on the maturity of the plant and the depth of the roots is where you're going to determine soil moisture. You can also do this with a soil probe. It's a long tube with a handle on it. You put this tube into the soil, pull out a soil core, and you can see where the moisture is at in the depth of the soil. So those are very handy, good tools to have to help you regulate the water application in your garden. Otherwise, you can do a field test. Dig down into the soil several inches, grab a handful of soil. If you squeeze it and water runs out, it's too wet. If you squeeze it and let go and the root ball won't, or I'm sorry, the soil ball doesn't hold together, it's probably too dry. Okay? So you want the soil to hold together after you open your hand, but then easily fall apart when you knock the soil. So it should be loosely held together, and that's perfect soil moisture. Okay? All right. Applying water properly in pots and in garden beds. In pots, you always want to water early in the day, right? And you want to apply the water to the soil, not over the leaves of the plant. Now there's a couple situations that I'll mention later where you can put water on the leaves of the plant, but it's not normally recommended. And you need to be sure when you're doing that while you're doing it. So I'll talk about it more later. Use drip irrigation in garden beds if at all possible. Make sure, though, you accommodate for the growing of the plant. So the roots, the part of the roots that take up moisture are as wide as the foliage on the plant. The best way I think I can describe this is if you have a tree that has a canopy that's 20 feet across, the roots that take up water are 20 feet out from the trunk. We call that the drip line. Okay? So you want to apply water to that area, not up near the trunk of the plant. And this is going to be true of your herbs in the garden as well. If you have a large rosemary plant, you want to apply the water out here, not right up against the trunk of that plant. So when you're using drip irrigation, you need to account for the growth of those roots and expand that drip irrigation. So plan ahead for that when you're growing perennial plants. Do not apply more water than can be absorbed by the soil at one time. So you may need to use something called water cycling or pulse irrigation. This can be done by hand or it can be done on an automatic system after you've timed it the first time. So oftentimes we apply water and it starts to run everywhere before it soaks into the soil. We want to make sure that our water is penetrating into the soil and not running off. It's not only a waste of water to have it run off, but that's where we get our pesticide and fertilizer runoff into watersheds, down the driveway, and into the storm drains, and so on. So water cycling, what you do is apply enough water so that you start by applying water before, and you stop right before runoff. Okay? So as soon as you see that the water's going to start to run away from where you're applying it, you stop the water. Time how long it takes for the water to soak into the soil, and then when the water has soaked in, there's no more water on top of the soil, you can apply more water. You want to time that as well. It may not take as long for the water to penetrate the second time because the soil's been moistened. A moist soil always readily accepts water better than a dry soil. But you're going to time each application of water so that you're avoiding runoff, and you're going to allow time in between each irrigation for the water to soak in. So you can do this again by hand the first time, or time your irrigation system and set your irrigation system accordingly. So sometimes you're going to water for 30 seconds, let the water penetrate, and then you may water for another 30 seconds and let the water penetrate. It could be a full minute, it could be a full 2 minutes. Just stop it right before runoff. You're going to do this repeatedly to get enough water in the soil to travel down past the root zone. Okay? Once your root zone, your soil profile is moist and you don't allow it to completely dry out, you'll be watering less frequently in the garden bed. And the same is true in your pots. You'll put less water on if you keep the soil moist, okay, over time. All right, you also should use a water breaker, like a watering can with the shower type head on it. A hose end sprayer should have like the water breaker on it. This will avoid the high pressure, stream of water splashing soil out of the pot and the raised beds. Okay? And sometimes that uncovers the roots, and you want to avoid doing that. All right, fertilizing. I mentioned earlier that most herbs in the garden beds don't need additions of fertilizer. Our soil, our mineral soils have nutrients in them. We can easily over-fertilize, so we want to avoid doing that. If your garden soil is rich, you've amended it with well-decomposed compost, there should be sufficient nutrients in that soil. You can add a low nitrogen organic fertilizer in spring to new annual plantings or to existing perennials. They're going to have a flush of growth in spring, and they may need more nutrients at that time. But you shouldn't need to add fertilizer in the garden bed on a regular basis. In the pot, I suggested slow release materials, so you don't have a lot of runoff of the water-soluble material after they're beginning to fill out in size and maturity. We're going to talk about pinching and pruning herbs. They may need, if you're frequently harvesting, and this is for the purpose of culinary use, so you may be harvesting frequently. You'll want to keep an eye on the health of the plant. They may need additions of fertilizer if you're frequently harvesting leaves, because they're going to continually be putting new leaves on, and they need nutrition to do that properly. You want to apply the appropriate fertilizer at the appropriate time. I mentioned the seedlings, half-strength water-soluble fertilizer once their first leaves have expanded. That's an appropriate fertilizer at the appropriate time. A slow-release fertilizer in a pot is the appropriate amount, appropriate type at the right time. Be aware, I've mentioned drainage more than once. Your fertilizers can be leached with the drainage of water. So as I said, don't apply so much water that the drainage is going everywhere. Okay? A lot of this over-application of water and water-soluble fertilizers, we end up with fertilizer in our underground aquifers, and we want to avoid that. So the slow-release materials are a good way, only applying it when the plants need it. So, is it a water problem or is it a nitrogen problem? That's a difficult thing to determine sometimes. Does it look like your plants are wilting? Are the leaves yellow? Are the leaf edges brown? Are the leaves dropping off? Are the leaves very small? Does the plant appear to be stunted or not growing at all? It's more often a watering issue. It's either too much or not enough water, and it's not being applied at the appropriate time in the appropriate amounts. So the leaf edge burn, that's from salt typically. So it's a lack of water and too much fertilizer. Okay? So, and that's a lack of water at the root zone, not at the soil surface. So watering too often, prolonged moisture, poor drainage, causes yellow leaves, causes leaves to fall off. Not enough water, again, or repeated shallow watering. So again, you need to apply enough water when you water to get it down into the root zone. Too much nitrogen, on the other hand, is going to make your plants more attractive to those insects and diseases. The nitrogen creates very succulent, weak growth on plants. And you'll notice this on your fruiting plants, that they tend to keep growing and never producing fruit. That's over-fertilization, and some of our pests and diseases just thrive on that weak, succulent growth. So we can keep our plants healthier by not over-fertilizing. I have a picture here. It's not as good as I hoped. But you can see some of the growth on the plants are yellow. Yes? If you have new growth that's yellow, that could be an iron issue. If you have the older growth that's yellow, that could be a nitrogen issue. Okay? So take a look at the plant. Get an overall look at that plant and then see what you think about its condition. Pruning herbs, we want to maintain the shape and promote foliar growth. So we do want them to grow as we pinch them and harvest them. But we're going to avoid heavy pruning prior to very cold temperatures when there's a chance for freeze or frost, because the new growth will be easily damaged by those cold temperatures. So avoid that at the wrong time of year. You want to cut or pinch the plant just above a bud or buds to promote new foliar growth. I have a picture here. So the buds are located where the leaves are attached at the stem. Sometimes your leaves are attached opposite to each other. Sometimes they're attached alternately to each other. So that's why I say pinch at a bud or buds. So if your leaves are opposite to each other, you can just cut the stem right above the leaf attachment. And if you look closely, you can see tiny little buds that are not developed yet, in the axil, where the leaf is attached to the stem here, there will be bud growth here. We call that the axillary bud. So if you cut your stem here, then you'll get new growth from those buds. If it's an alternate leaf arrangement, you would cut above one or the other of those. Yes? Okay. So pruning will reduce flower production. Now for culinary herbs, we want to keep them growing vegetatively or leaf growth, not flowering. So when you have to look closely. When you see the flower buds beginning to develop, you want to pinch those off and use the same technique. Okay? If you're pruning your perennials, like rosemary with the thick woody stems, you're going to need to use hand pruners. You want to make sure they're very sharp. Sharp tools make a much nicer clean cut that heals quickly and does not allow then disease and insects to infest the stem. So always clean, sharp tools. All right, so we've gone through how to keep our plants healthy by growing them properly. Doesn't mean they'll never get a pest or a disease. We can't keep those things out of the environment, but if we grow healthy plants, we're way into our integrated pest management strategy. But I'm going to talk now about a few other strategies we can apply along with growing the plants in a healthy way. We're going to try to prevent those pests and disease. We're going to ID them correctly when we do get them. We're going to try to keep their population numbers reduced, keeping in mind we may have to tolerate some small number of these organisms. And there's a good reason for that, because we want to encourage the presence of natural enemies, those other organisms in the environment that will help us to combat the pests. And sometimes disease as well. There's all kinds of organisms out there that do really great things for us. If there's not a source of food in the garden, they won't come and they won't stay around. So some amount of flowering, it could be important for these as well. So I'll talk about that. So let's look at foliar diseases. We're going to ID them, talk about prevention, and then how do we control them if they do arise. Your basil, cilantro, parsley, dill, and mint may all be subject to powdery mildew or rust. Probably not both, one or the other. So your powdery mildew is that white, that white fungal growth on you often see it on your squash and things like that. It can also be on these other plants up here. Water, this is the one time, if you're sure you have powdery mildew, that you can actually apply some water to the leaves. Powdery mildew does not spread with water, and it does not proliferate in standing water on the leaves. So you would want to do this early in the morning hours so that the leaves have a chance to dry off. Okay? Rust diseases, on the other hand, you might have seen this on your roses or some of your other plants. It's typically orangish yellow, little mounds of pustules on the underside of the leaves. The upper side of the leaves will have yellow spots all over it. Everywhere you see rust growth on the underside, you'll see a yellow spot on the upper surface. Rust does transfer from leaf to leaf and plant to plant with water. So you can see how important it is to ID these problems correctly. You have a card in your folder with the ipm.uc Davis email address or web address on it. Great source for identifying these issues. Wonderful pictures, lots of information in addition to everything that Scott brought for you today on these specific issues. So learn to identify them correctly. You can handle them and deal with them much more readily and much more effectively once you know what they are. Okay, you can see here there's some conditions under which powdery mildew it really thrives, right? So when we have cool, cloudy nights and warm, dry days, powdery mildew is usually the issue at that time. There's another fungal disease called downy mildew. You see it on basil. The disease produces lavender, brownish gray, or white spores on the lower surface of the leaves. So it's going to look very much like the mold on your cheese in a way. It looks like mold. It may occur at the same time as other foliar diseases, so you need to be aware of everything that's going on. You'll have angular yellow spots develop on the upper leaf surfaces. So one way to prevent this is to look at the leaves at least weekly on the basil. Turn them over, look at the underside of the leaf. You don't have to look at every leaf, but every week go out there and just turn those leaves over and take a look at them. You want to be careful not to spread disease from leaf to leaf or plant to plant with your hands or your gloves. So if you do find a leaf that's infected with something, take that leaf off, throw it away, wash your hands before you touch the plant or other plants again. We can spread these things with contact. Okay. Preventing the diseases is often done just with good cultural practices like we talked about earlier. Put the plants in full sun if that's what they require. Do not water overhead. Provide good air circulation. Make sure that your garden has good airflow, that your plants aren't too crowded together. If they are, start pruning them back. Make sure that air can move in and around the plants. Remove plant debris. If leaves are falling on the ground, you want to pick those up. You can compost them, but you better be sure your compost is reaching a high temperature. Otherwise, just put them in the trash, throw them out. And avoid that excess fertilizer. Yeah? Okay? So preventing these diseases is the best thing we can do. If they do occur, again, remove the infected foliage or the entire plant if it's very bad. Okay? You want to be careful, again, not to spread it. Some of these diseases can be spread in the wind. The spores blow around. Once they reach a mature stage, they can blow around and infect new tissues. Control your moderate to mild infections with the least toxic fungicides. I'm sorry for the overlap here. But horticultural oils or plant-based oils, such as neem or jojoba oil. Least toxic, they're least toxic to those natural enemies I mentioned earlier. Whatever you use, whether it's sulfur, a biological fungicide, make sure you're reading the label. The label is going to give you important information about application, how much, when, and especially since you're going to be consuming these plants days to harvest after application. You want to be very careful that you're not spraying one day and harvesting the next. You want to read that label very carefully and apply the product correctly, of course avoiding runoff to any other part of the garden or the environment. So read those labels and follow the directions. Some of these oils can burn foliage if they're applied in the hot afternoon to a dry plant. So always in the morning to a plant that's well watered, that's at the appropriate soil moisture. There's some publications through the university that are excellent resources in addition to the online pages that you can find. If you're really having some issues in the garden, the Pests of the Garden and Small Farm, Master Gardener's Handbook, all kinds of things out there that are great, and they're very reasonably priced, by the way. I recommend these publications for use in my classes. They're very, very helpful. Okay, soil-borne diseases. So we have the ones that move around in the air, and then we have ones that exist in the soil. They're often already in the soil, but they only become a problem with poor water management. So again, managing the water is going to be key to growing healthy plants and avoiding these diseases. There are several different types. They're fungus-like diseases. They move around in water. They can be transferred in the soil from place to place on your boots and tools. So good sanitation is important, but they require a specific environmental condition in order to infect and become prolific in the garden. So proper watering is going to go a long way to avoiding those. There's some of these diseases are called damping off, and you'll see that your seedlings become sort of brown and soft at the soil level. The stem becomes sort of mushy and the plant falls over. That's an indication that you have a damping off disease and water management is poor. Okay, so you want to try to avoid that with good water management. And then the root rot symptoms, plants will often wilt and then die rapidly. So what do we do when we see our plant wilt? Water it, right? Mm-hmm. And so really what we're doing if there's a disease present is we're just exacerbating the problem. So what we want to do is maybe pull up one or two of those plants if you have more than one, and take a look at the root system. This is a nice healthy root system. This plant is wilted, and when you pull it out of the ground, the roots are brown and soft. You can pull the outer coating of the root off of the root, and that's a root rot disease. So it's typically an issue with poor water management. So you want to be aware of that, right? If the plant is constantly wilting, even though the soil is moist, you better pull it out and take a look at the roots. Okay, preventing these diseases. Again, plant the plants at the proper depth. That will avoid the stems becoming rotten with too much water. Manage the water properly. Provide that good drainage. Use your clean compost. Again, your compost, your organic material must be well decomposed and broken down. Avoid the excessive fertilizer. It makes the plants, the roots weak and more susceptible to these diseases. A healthy root system can actually avoid infection. If you do find that you've possibly got one of these pathogens in the soil, dry out the soil. Keep tilling it until it's dried out. And then the disease will, what's the word I'm looking for? I apologize. You go into remission, I guess, right? That kind of thing. Okay? And then you can start again with good water management practices. Okay? Soil solarization. If you think you've had a problem in the past, or you're concerned about weed seeds or other issues in that area, this takes some time, about 4 to 6 weeks in the very warmest part of the summer. So you need to plan ahead for it. This might not be a good year for it unless you have a place that you'd like to prep for next year. What you're going to do is till the soil, just like you're doing a water, wait, and cultivate. Till it, knock those weeds down, till them under. Then you're going to prep the soil by removing the debris and all that material, level it out to your desired level. irrigate it, get it nice and moist, and then put clear plastic over the top. Pin that plastic down so there's no air movement underneath. You want that soil to stay moist and hot. That will kill weed seeds. It'll kill some of these disease pathogens and some other organisms like nematodes, little roundworms in the soil that attack root systems. So it's a great way to eliminate some of these soil issues. And then the sanitation. Clean the debris from your shoes and tools, the soil, clean it off, and discard diseased plants and sterilize containers if you're using pots before reusing them. Okay, the weeds, they will, if allowed to grow, they will rob your plants of nutrients, water, space, sunlight, so they are definitely competitors, and they're very good competitors. So you want to keep those weeds under control. They can quickly shade out those young garden plants. So get rid of the weeds first. The weeds are also hosts for disease and insect pests. So I've shown here, this is sow thistle, creeping wood sorrel. This one's hard to control if you let it get out of hand. Petty spurge, and then your chickweed. These are very common garden pests. The spittle, there's an insect called spittlebug, will move into your rosemary from some of these weeds, and aphids and thrips, which I'll talk to you about in a minute, will feed on the weeds and readily move into your garden plants. So not only are they, resource users, but they're also hosts. You could have other diseases like rust, for example, will move into the garden as well. So controlling weeds can be done with the soil solarization, but you want to exclude and prevent them. So never let the weeds go to seed in the surrounding areas of your garden. If you let some of these weeds have hundreds of seeds in one flower. So always control them before they get flowers on them and then begin to develop seed. Do the water weight and cultivate, or the soil solarization. And then when they start to pop up here and there again, the hand weeding is the best way. Pull them out by hand, which is easily done in a moist soil, or use your tools, to hoe them, knock them down, and keep them from growing. Some of these weeds, you may have to do that repeatedly until they stop sprouting, because they have underground perennial structures. You'll want to keep knocking them down until they stop coming up. Okay, so the hand weeding and the hoeing is the most important thing we can do. The more often you do it, eventually the less weeds you have. Okay, again, mulching, use a coarse textured mulch, 3 to 4 inches thick, and then the solarization. All right, insect pests, snails and slugs. These are probably the ones that give us the biggest trouble. So the best thing you can do is be a scout. Be out there looking for them. Learn to recognize the good and the bad. So the bad ones today we're talking about are aphids. These are sapsuckers. They produce honeydew by sucking out the sugar from the plant and then excreting that sugar. So we call that honeydew. It's a sweet little dewdrop of insect excrement. Ants love it. I know, why would we call that honeydew, right? That's what it looks like. Ants love that. So if you have ants in your plants, you may have one of these sucking insect pests. There are lots of them, not just aphids. But then you may also start to develop what's called sooty mold. And sooty mold is a fungus that exists in the environment, and it blows around in the wind, and when it comes in contact with this honeydew excrement, it lives off of that sugar, and it begins to grow. It doesn't actually infect the plant tissues, but you can see if it gets bad enough, it covers up the photosynthetic tissues of the plant. So it can reduce plant health. So whenever you see that, it's a sign you have a sucking pest. You need to deal with that, and you can wash the sooty mold away. Okay. Spittlebug I mentioned. Spittlebug really likes rosemary, so you want to keep an eye out for this. The bugs are actually inside this spittle material. It's rather gross, but they hide in there, which protects them from their natural enemies and any pesticidal products you may apply. So you'll want to be on the lookout for that. We'll talk about how to deal with them. Thrips are little teeny tiny cigar-shaped insects, usually black and or yellow and black. You very often don't see the insect until they've made the damage. So they will scrape the cells of the plant and consume the cell contents. They can also transfer disease. So you want to keep an eye out for those. Of course, your armyworms and other caterpillars are foliage feeders. They do this kind of chewing damage like snails and slugs. So snails and slugs, you can usually find them cool, moist areas in the early morning or just before sunset at dusk and clean them up. Okay, but we'll talk more about these. Scott mentioned you have some handouts in your packet about a couple of new invasive pests. This Bagrata bug, these are really teeny tiny red and black stages, the young stages of this adult here. These really don't look like lady beetles. They're very small compared to a lady beetle, but they are red and black. Lady beetles are often dark orange or bright orange with black spots. Just don't confuse them, because lady beetles are a good natural enemy in the garden. These are not. Remove them. You can vacuum them off with a shop vac or something like that. Let them die inside the vacuum before you open the vacuum and let them fly away. Don't plant their very attractive host plants like Sweet Alyssum is an ornamental with white, nice smelling flowers, but they really love that there. And then we typically find them in organic farms and community gardens, residences, and places like that. So knock them into a bucket of soapy water if you come across them, vacuum them off. Pesticides are not going to be very effective unless you're using the right product at the right time, and that can get very complicated. So we're going to use other integrated pest management methods to control these. The same with brown marmorated stink bug. Now there are lots of stink bugs out there in the environment. Some are green, some are brown. These have very distinctive markings on them. You can read your handout to find out how exactly to identify them as brown marmorated stink bug. They are fruit damagers. You wouldn't have too much trouble with them on herbs, but just so that you know they are out there, to keep an eye out for these. Again, you can hand pick them, brush them off, knock them off into soapy water, vacuum them off, and let them die in the shop vac or the dust buster kind of thing, whichever you have. You can also cover your plants with row covers. Those are fairly easy to build and destroy the egg masses if you find them. So these are some new pests that we just want you to be aware of, although you may not necessarily find them in an herb garden. If you're growing other things, they might come around now and then. All right, so how do we manage these insects, pests, and other things? We're going to focus on the long-term goal, not short-term satisfaction of pesticide. Pesticide use typically puts us on what we call a pesticide treadmill. The more we use, the more we have to use, and that's typically because we're killing the natural enemies along with the pests. And the natural enemies can't recover as quickly as the pest organisms do. So we want to avoid that, if at all possible. So the first thing we're going to do to manage aphids, the thrips, and the spittle bugs is identify them correctly and allow their natural enemies to prey on them or parasitize them. So some natural enemies will actually feed on or consume the insect itself. Other natural enemies, little teeny tiny wasps and flies, will lay their eggs in the insect, in the pest insect, and then the new generation of wasp or fly grows up inside the aphid, effectively killing the aphid. So there's lots of organisms out there, and you probably see a lot of them all the time. Maybe you're recognizing some, maybe you're not. But I recommend that you get into the UCIPM website and or some of those publications and learn to recognize some of these more common natural enemies, and I'll show you some in a bit. Aphids can be picked off by hand. They're a little mushy, but you just kind of pull them off, right? You can do this with gloves. You don't have to do it with a bare hand. You can knock them off with a strong spray of water, but remember, you know, you've got issues with diseases and things like that that you're trying to avoid as well. So hand picking or pulling off the most infested leaves is probably the best way to deal with those. And encourage the natural enemies with other flowering plants in the garden, or maybe let one out of your 2 or 3 herbs flower rather than pinching off the flowers. So those natural enemies like the flowering herbs. Some of the natural enemy adult stages will come in to feed on the flower nectar, depositing their eggs. Their larvae hatch from the eggs, and the larvae are the stage that actually eat the aphids and other insects and things like that. So if we provide a good habitat for them, they will come. Yes. The insecticidal soaps and horticultural oils are least toxic for our natural enemies. The other more toxic pesticides are not effective because they kill these natural enemies, and then our pest populations get out of control. You can manage the bagrata bug, the stink bugs, and the caterpillars again by hand picking. Microbial products like Bacillus thuringiensis, the floating row covers I mentioned, and you can trap, collect, and dispose of the snails and slugs. Copper strips around the edges of your raised beds or some of your larger stems or trunks of your plants. You can build a trap for snails and slugs using wood, or a hollowed out cantaloupe or watermelon rind upside down in the garden provides a nice, moist, dark environment for them to hide under. You go out in the morning and collect it and throw it away. So any environment that you can provide for them to hide under, and then you can go out and clean them up. And if you do this often enough, you're eventually going to eliminate, well, severely reduce, yes? Sometimes you can eliminate them if you keep up with it. All right, our beneficial natural enemies. We have the lady beetle, adult and larva. Her larva stage looks much different than the adult. Yes? So we want to learn to recognize both stages because they're both good. This one's actually eating an aphid here. The green lacewing, I know you've seen these flittering around your garden or porch lights at night in your trees and shrubs. This is her larva. This one in particular will eat any soft-bodied insect, sometimes each other. So they're wonderful. If you find them, if you see them, let them be. They're there because they found a food source or a nectar source. She'll lay her eggs, and then you'll have these larvae. This is the minute pirate bug. Little bit harder to notice, but it is out there, and it's a good predator as well. And then these are decollet snails. Notice their shell is much more elongated. They can become a pest of the garden once they've eliminated all the other brown garden snails. If they do become a problem, you can start collecting them and sharing them to eliminate the large numbers in your yard. And then this beetle here is a predator of snails and slugs. It's called the devil's coach horse. It's black, it's kind of long, and it's got 3 distinct body parts: the head, thorax, and an abdomen. Okay? I mentioned that herbs, when they're in flower, are very attractive to these natural enemies. So if you don't mind planting an extra plant or 2 and letting it flower, it would be a good way to attract some of these in. Again, they're going to need a food source. So if you're trying to keep your garden pristine and free of every aphid, thrips, and everything else in the garden, you're not going to have natural enemies either. So we have to sort of maybe change our perspective a little bit. And keep in mind, again, that short-term satisfaction it costs everyone with the watershed contamination, puts us on that treadmill. So every time we use a pesticide, we're probably going to have to use it again and again. So they're not effective for the long term. We would strongly encourage you to try these integrated pest management methods because pesticides are expensive and they become more and more difficult to manage these problems in the garden the more we use them. If the pesticides are applied incorrectly, they can have toxic effects on other non-target organisms, those organisms in your yard that you did not want to have a negative impact on. Some of these very toxic broad spectrum products that kill everything have a long residual as well. So It could be 2 weeks later where you can still get some of this material off of the leaves of the plant. It's still in the soil and so on. So we want to avoid, if we're using them at all, avoid letting them leave your property in any way. And again, if you don't use these products correctly, you're going to have problems with your plants too. You can do more harm than good sometimes. So when these products are applied to our homes, they can very easily end up leaving our landscapes by drifting through the air, washing into a storm drain when we water or when we have rain. They do not get treated in the storm drain system, so they flow all the way through the watershed, through the creeks and rivers, into the lagoons and out to the ocean. And then we have problems with the food chain. Aquatic invertebrates get killed, the fish can't feed, the birds lose a source of food in the fish, and so on. So there are products out there that have been taken off the market because of the amount of material found in our watersheds and the negative impact they're having. So that's the whole purpose of our program, is to reduce the use of these materials and still let you know that there are other ways that you can grow beautiful, healthy gardens and not have these negative impacts. I have a feeling I put the wrong watershed in here, but you guys are right up in here somewhere, aren't you? Okay? So our watershed includes our municipal and domestic water supply. It includes recreation areas and the wildlife and estuarine habitat. So we want to keep them as healthy as we can. Use the least toxic chemical, if you have to, that will control the pest. So again, those insecticidal soaps and horticultural oils. Read the label, again, not only for proper use, but for days to harvest on your edible foods. Read the label for possible toxicity to plants and apply them at the right time, and effects on beneficial organisms. Spot spray, if you have to use something, even a horticultural oil or insecticidal soap. Only apply it to where it's needed. It won't do any good to apply it to areas where there's not a problem. And avoid allowing these materials to blow through the wind. Read your pesticide label, particularly for the active ingredient. And then this turns out it's a good ingredient. It's from the seeds of the neem tree, so we find that in the neem oil. And we'll remind you then that it's the water that connects us. Read those labels, follow the directions. Store the pesticides in a safe location, locked up, out of the reach of children. Never put them in other containers. Always keep them in their original container, and dispose of them properly. And we've provided a phone number if you have some materials you want to get rid of, you just weren't sure how to go about doing that. Call 1-800-CLEANUP to find the most convenient disposal site for your area. And then other numbers here, if you find that you're running into a problem and you can't seem to find the answers that you're looking for, these numbers would be a good source of information for you. We have a couple master gardeners. Are they still here, Scott? Where'd they go?
Susanna Ball.
Susanna?
Byron Asakawa. And Margaret Yorio. I'd like to
Byron.
thank all three of them for joining us.
And Margaret. They volunteer. They be on the hotline, and they come out to help us with these programs to get the word out about good, healthy gardening practices. So if you have questions, please stay. We'll answer your questions one at a time until everybody's satisfied with the answer, I hope. Okay, and thanks for coming out today. I enjoyed it.